The conquest of Jericho in Joshua 6:26. The hypothesis for this case study is words have longevity and they keep living until they come to pass. Words have longevity and they keep living until they come to pass. And that is we're looking at Joshua 6:26 here. Okay. All right. Here's the context. In Joshua 6, God promises to give the children of Israel victory at Jericho. He gives Joshua strict instructions on what to do for 7 days. And we find this in verse 3 through 5. And I'm going to read those verses for you. Joshua 6, verses 3 through 5. I'm going to read it here. It says, these are the instructions that God gives them. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up and everyone straight in. All right. The Bible then tells us that the children of Israel followed the instructions of God. And in verse 20, the walls collapsed and everyone went in and took the city. In verse 26, and this is the NIV version, this is what I find really fascinating. After all of this happened, it says, at the time Joshua pronounced this solemn oath, cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. And at the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. So what do we see happening here? First of all, we see that Joshua is taking an oath. And I talked to y'all a lot about oaths. What is an oath? In the Hebrew, oath means to legalize a covenant or agreement. So Joshua is legalizing a covenant or agreement. In the Hebrew translation, the oath was a curse on the head of anyone who broke the agreement, right? So today, an oath is a promise made before some institutional authority, right? People take oaths in court. People take oaths before governmental officials. In taking an oath, a person not only assumes an obligation, but also becomes liable to persecution because the state and society have a vested interest. So Joshua in this scripture is making a legal covenant before God that whoever decides to rebuild the city of Jericho, their first and last sons die. Where is this? This is in Joshua 6, verse 26. Well, you would be surprised when I went on over to 1 Kings 16 and 34 and saw the cursed land. 1 Kings 16 and 34. All right. So let me back up a little bit. In 1 Kings 16 and 29, though, Ahab becomes king of Judah, and the Bible tells us that he did more evil in God's sight than any other people who came before him, right? Some things we know he did was marry Jezebel and start to worship Baal, and that's in verse 31. But in 1 Kings 16:34, it says, in Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn Abiram. And he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segum, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, the son of Nun. So in 1 Kings 16, verse 34, we see Hiel rebuilding the walls. And what did he lose? He lost his first son and he lost his last son. Joshua spoke those words 530 years before Hiel tried to rebuild the city. So these words were living in the spirit realm for 530 years until someone decided to rebuild Jericho and the curse landed. The word curse landed. Hiel lost his first son and his last son. So what do we learn? We learn that words don't stop creating and that they will continue to create until they accomplish their goals. We see that word curses are real. and that the power of death and life are in the tongue, according to Proverbs 18 and 21. And I said this in the teaching on earlier this week, when I mentioned that sometimes we like to say life and death is in the power of the tongue. That is not the correct ordering of the scripture. The correct ordering of the scripture is death and life are in the power of the tongue. We are naturally bent to curse. Naturally, that's easier for us to do. So we see Joshua pronounced this curse over anyone who tried to rebuild Jericho 530 years previously. Hiel rebuilds it, and guess what? Cost of his first son, cost of his last son. In accordance to the words that Joshua spoke. So Joshua literally changed the destiny of Hiel and Jericho with his words. How? Because he not only spoke to the present reality, but to the system of Jericho. Remember, we just went over the system in the last case study. He spoke to the system of Jericho. So it didn't matter if Hiel didn't know that the words were spoken over Jericho over 500 years ago. It didn't matter if he didn't know.